Across immeasurable stretches of time, humanity existed without leaving monuments to mark its presence. Our ancestors traversed continents, following seasonal abundance and animal pathways, leaving behind only fleeting traces charcoal scattered in ancient hearths, skeletal remains buried beneath sediment. These early humans were biologically indistinguishable from ourselves. They commanded language with sophistication, experienced profound emotional complexity, and wielded cognitive abilities capable of navigating intricate environmental challenges. Yet throughout 97% of our existence, they erected no fortifications. They acknowledged no sovereign authority. They waged no campaigns to subjugate distant populations. Then something shattered. Within a fragment of geological time, our species executed a fundamental restructuring of its relationship with the natural order. Movement ceased. The untamed world became enclosed. Nature's organic hierarchies transformed into the disciplined patterns of cultivated land and urban settlements. This transition from nomadic bands to concentrated political states represents the most profound discontinuity in our biological trajectory. It marked the moment when humanity abandoned environmental adaptation and commenced planetary reorganization. Conventional narratives frequently depict pre-agricultural existence as perpetual deprivation, a condition Thomas Hobbes famously characterized as solitary, poor, and brutish. Osteological evidence contradicts this assumption. Skeletal remains from the late Paleolithic period indicate populations possessing remarkable physical robustness. Adults achieved statures that Western European populations would not replicate until the 20th century. Bone density remained high, devoid of the repetitive strain pathologies that would subsequently afflict agricultural communities. These populations were not teetering on extinction's precipice. They had achieved profound environmental synchronization. Continuation required intimate knowledge animal migration patterns, botanical cycles, topographical variations, transmitted across generations through oral tradition. A single foraging collective demanded several hundred square miles to sustain itself, relocating as resources matured, migrated, or vanished. Their social organization embodied what researchers term an immediate return economy. Provisions were consumed shortly following acquisition. Without viable preservation methodologies for meat or vegetation across extended durations, accumulation remained impossible. Wealth could not be stockpiled and therefore could not be concentrated. This constraint generated a distinctive political structure, pronounced egalitarianism. Dominance patterns characteristic of other primate species faced active resistance. When individuals attempted coercion or resource monopolization, the collective possessed a straightforward countermeasure: departure. In a boundless landscape absent fixed property claims, liberty was measured through distance. Throughout millennia spanning the Pleistocene epoch, this equilibrium persisted. Human populations remained constrained by wild environment carrying capacity. We functioned as predators integrated within existing trophic systems rather than architects of their reconstruction. Climate reinforced these conditions. Earth remained locked in glacial cycles. Temperature oscillations occurred abruptly. Ice formations advanced and withdrew. Environmental volatility rendered permanent settlement unfeasible. The planet offered no foundation for cultivation until frozen barriers began retreating. Approximately 12,000 years before present, the Holocene epoch commenced. Global conditions entered an era of elevated temperatures and climatic consistency. Throughout the Near Eastern corridor, this atmospheric transformation generated a zone of sustained ecological productivity, the Fertile Crescent. Natural circumstances converged favorably. This territory harbored wild progenitors of crops that would eventually sustain vast civilizations: emmer wheat, einkorn, barley, legumes including chickpeas and lentils, plus flax for fiber production. These botanical species proliferated in dense, naturally occurring concentrations. Gazelle populations migrated through these valleys in substantial numbers. For foraging communities inhabiting this region, survival's fundamental calculus shifted. Energy obtained from provisions dramatically exceeded energy expended during procurement. Here emerged a culture archaeologists identify as the Natufians. They provide our earliest substantive evidence regarding civilization's genesis. For generations, scholarly consensus maintained that agriculture precipitated sedentism, that humans mastered cultivation techniques, then constructed villages to tend their fields. Natufian archaeological deposits suggest the reverse sequence occurred. They established permanent settlements millennia before intentionally planting a single seed. Reliable wild grain availability permitted construction of enduring circular stone dwellings. They fabricated substantial storage facilities and grinding implements weighing hundreds of pounds, objects severely restricting mobility and signaling durable territorial claims. They became sedentary hunter-gatherers, an evolutionary paradox. Permanent architecture catalyzed profound social transformations. Natufians initiated formal burial practices in designated mortuary zones, frequently beneath residential floors. A novel conceptual framework was crystallizing within human consciousness, lineage and inheritance. Land transitioned from transitory space into place bound to memory, descent and social obligation. Sedentism triggered biological chain reactions. Within mobile bands, mothers could transport only one infant simultaneously. Births naturally occurred at 4 to 5 year intervals. Within settled villages, that constraint dissolved. Natufian women could deliver children biennially. Consequently, population density escalated. Small bands comprising several dozen individuals expanded into villages housing several hundred residents. Pressure upon local ecosystems intensified. The wild abundance enabling settlement was being consumed faster than regeneration rates permitted. Then climate reversed course against them. Around 10,800 BCE, a sudden climatic deterioration called the Younger Dryas impacted the northern hemisphere. Glacial meltwater discharged into the North Atlantic, disrupting thermohaline circulation patterns that had stabilized global temperatures. The climate cooled precipitously throughout the Levant. Environmental conditions degraded. Forests contracted. Grasslands diminished. Ecological rhythms supporting dense communities began collapsing. For Natufian populations, this shift created an unprecedented dilemma. The abundance that had facilitated permanent settlement was evaporating. They confronted a binary choice. One pathway involved abandoning villages, dissolving large communities, and resuming fully nomadic existence. But this necessitated drastic population reduction. The surrounding environment could no longer sustain such numbers as foragers. The alternative pathway demanded intervention. Unable to depend upon natural grain regeneration, they transitioned to active management. They eliminated competing vegetation. They selectively harvested and redistributed seeds. They modified soil composition and regulated water access. These actions signified a fundamental transformation in our environmental relationship. Agriculture was not embraced as a trajectory toward prosperity or abundance. It emerged as a survival strategy. Farming was not born from aspiration, but from necessity, a mechanism to stabilize societies incapable of reverting to previous equilibria. Human selection began transforming wheat architecture. Through repeated harvesting and replanting of these variants, humans inadvertently altered botanical biology. Domesticated wheat forfeited independent reproductive capacity. The agricultural transition brought measurable declines in individual health outcomes. Diets previously encompassing diverse plants, animals, fibers, and micronutrients constricted to heavy reliance upon starchy grain staples. Nutritional diversity yielded to caloric standardization. Skeletal records document this change. Average adult height among early farming populations throughout the Near East declined by several inches. Novel physical stresses emerged. Grain processing demanded hours of repetitive labor. Joint degeneration occurred. Spinal compression developed. Women performing most processing work frequently sustained chronic damage to feet and lower spines from prolonged kneeling at grinding stations. Permanent settlements introduced additional hazards, infectious disease. Mobile hunter-gatherer groups rarely provided stable conditions for pathogen persistence. Agricultural communities did precisely that. Dense populations cohabited in confined quarters, often alongside newly domesticated animals. Shared water, air, and waste streams created transmission vectors for infections crossing species barriers. Diseases including influenza, tuberculosis, and smallpox discovered novel opportunities for propagation. Despite deteriorating health and escalating labor demands, the agricultural mechanism continued expanding. farming generated substantially more calories per land unit, supporting larger populations even as individual lifespans shortened and fragility increased. Reproductive success superseded physical resilience as the dominant evolutionary advantage. Population density increased, villages proliferated, and with them emerged a challenge humanity had never previously encountered: living permanently among strangers. Across open landscapes, conflict resolution occurred through spatial separation. When two foragers disagreed, they parted ways. Within agricultural societies, separation carried exponentially greater costs. A cultivator invested months of labor into singular land parcels. His survival became bound to that soil. Departure meant abandoning harvests and, with them, futures. Immobility restructured human relationships fundamentally. Land became a fixed resource claimed, cultivated, and defended. The conceptual framework of exclusive property began consolidating. Where value concentrates, protection inevitably follows. At Jericho, approximately 8000 BCE, we encounter among the earliest physical manifestations of this transformation. The settlement was enclosed by massive stone fortifications and dominated by a tower approaching 30 feet in height. For decades, archaeologists debated its function: flood mitigation, ceremonial monument, communal symbol. Contemporary interpretations converge upon a practical explanation: the structure protected stored resources. In a world where provisions could be accumulated, they could also be seized. A granary filled with grain represented simultaneous security and vulnerability. Agriculture did not merely produce sustenance, it produced targets. Raiding supplanted wandering. Defense became imperative. Violence reorganized itself around territory, storage, and control. Such systems required coordination. Large-scale construction and surplus administration could not arise from informal consensus alone. Someone had to strategize. Someone had to direct labor. Gradually, social symmetry eroded. The egalitarian structure of mobile societies yielded to hierarchy. Certain individuals accumulated influence by controlling resources, orchestrating labor, or managing protection. Archaeology records this transition through mortuary practices. Most burials remained modest, but a small fraction grew increasingly elaborate, adorned with materials transported across considerable distances: obsidian from Anatolia, turquoise from Sinai, marine shells from the Mediterranean coast. Status had entered the grave. The divide between accumulation and scarcity, between influence and dependence, had begun widening. For the first time in history, inequality was not merely temporary, it was becoming institutionalized. For millennia, the Neolithic experiment remained confined to highlands where rainfall was adequate and effort modest. Seasonal precipitation arrived with reasonable predictability, and crops could be cultivated without extensive intervention. Around 5000 BCE, expanding populations pressed outward. Communities descended from earlier Neolithic cultivators migrated beyond highlands into the broad, low-elevation basin between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamia. In its natural state, this landscape opposed settlement. Rainfall was insufficient. Summer temperatures reached extreme thresholds. The rivers, while life-sustaining, were volatile, capable of sudden inundations, erasing fields and structures with minimal warning. The environment oscillated between aridity and deluge. Yet beneath these hazards lay extraordinary productive potential. Across thousands of years, rivers had deposited profound layers of fertile alluvium. Few soils globally could rival its capacity to generate sustenance, provided water could be controlled and directed. Settlers of the southern alluvial plain executed a consequential decision. They abandoned rainfall dependence and embraced irrigation. Survival would henceforth depend upon canals, embankments, and coordinated labor. It was a bargain that restructured human society. Rainfall uncertainty was replaced by water management discipline. In exchange for Earth's highest yields, they accepted constant maintenance obligations. The agricultural system had crossed a threshold. From this juncture forward, civilization would no longer rest upon natural rhythms but upon continuous human intervention. To irrigate a field in southern Mesopotamia, canals had to be excavated across miles of terrain. Sediment had to be removed season after season. Embankments had to be elevated to contain spring floods. These tasks exceeded household capacity, even village capacity. They required sustained, coordinated labor at unprecedented scales. Water, to be allocated, scheduled, and monitored. From this necessity, novel authority emerged. The decentralized autonomy of earlier communities yielded to centralized command. Those controlling water flow controlled survival. Some framed this authority through religious terminology, claiming to mediate between human communities and forces governing rivers. Practically, their power rested in administration, measurement, and enforcement. Compliance ensured access. Disobedience meant exclusion. By approximately 4000 BCE, the southern Mesopotamian plains were no longer natural landscapes shaped primarily by climate. They were engineered environments, networks of canals, fields, and storage centers operating as unified production systems. At the system's center, population density increased rapidly. What had begun as agricultural management was evolving into something far more enduring. The foundations of the first cities were taking form. By approximately 3800 BCE, the village was no longer humanity's dominant settlement form. The city had materialized. Uruk represented an entirely novel mode of existence. At its zenith, between 40 and 50,000 people inhabited roughly 6 square miles enclosed by walls. For a species that evolved to live in small bands of several dozen individuals, this density level was unprecedented. In a village, social life was governed by familiarity. In Uruk, that system disintegrated. Each day, an individual moved among thousands of strangers. At this scale, social cohesion could no longer rely upon personal relationships. It required institutions. The city functioned as a powerful gravitational force. It drew raw materials from vast distances: timber from Zagros Mountains, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, pulling entire regions into its economic orbit. At the center stood the temple complex, operating simultaneously as religious authority and economic landlord. It controlled fields, canals, and herds. The population became dependent upon institutional estates for land access, provisions, and security. This transformation is visible in the most ubiquitous artifact of the Uruk period, the mass-produced clay bowl. Archaeologists designated the beveled rim bowl. Millions scatter across Mesopotamian ruins. They are crude, mold-made, and nearly identical. Produced rapidly in enormous quantities with no concern for durability or aesthetics, these vessels functioned as standardized ration containers. Each bowl held a fixed volume representing a daily allotment distributed to workers. The bowl's uniformity suggests a system designed for measurement, not domestic life. Their presence reveals a profound shift in human existence. Large population segments were no longer producing their own sustenance. They labored on canals, walls, and fields controlled by institutions, and in return received measured rations from centralized storehouses. Food became compensation. Labor became abstracted. The independent producer was replaced by the dependent worker. The city's walls offered protection, but they also enforced permanence. Leaving the system meant abandoning access to sustenance itself. As Uruk expanded, human memory reached its limitations. Administration required innovation. Writing emerged as a practical solution. The earliest clay tablets from Uruk contain no narratives or cosmologies. They are ledgers, inventories, tax assessments, wage distributions. The first written symbols represent commodities and labor: barley, sheep, work units. Writing began as accounting. This development altered power relationships fundamentally. Information became centralized. Access to records determined authority. Those who could read and write controlled resource flows. The scribe emerged as a novel specialist, not a ruler, but an intermediary between people and the system governing them. With written records, institutions gained oversight levels previously impossible. Production, storage, and labor could be quantified, predicted, and enforced. Obligations were fixed in clay. Administration no longer relied upon trust or memory, but upon recorded data. The city had acquired memory beyond the human mind, and with it, a novel form of control. By 2500 BCE, priestly dominance was fading. A new power had eclipsed the temple, the Lugalar the king. As Mesopotamian cities expanded across the floodplain, they collided. Disputes over land and water hardened into organized conflict. The small-scale raids of earlier societies yielded to standing armies, and warfare shifted from sporadic event to permanent institution. With this came monopoly on force. The king offered a stark transaction, protection from rivals in exchange for loyalty, labor, and taxation. Security became political leverage. This militarization reshaped the nature of captivity. In mobile bands, prisoners were liabilities. Within city walls, confinement was now possible and economically useful. Captives were not executed, but absorbed, forced to raise walls and dig canals of their conquerors. Sumerian records reflect this reality. The cuneiform sign denoting a slave combines symbols for foreigner and human, encoding conquest directly into language. The infrastructure of early civilizations rested not merely upon voluntary devotion, but upon coerced labor of those taken in war. Mesopotamia established an early model of urban civilization, but it was not the only one. Along the Nile, a different environment forged a different power form. Protected by deserts and fed by predictable inundations, Egypt favored stability over constant conflict. Here, political power and religious authority were absolute. The pharaoh was not merely a king, but a divine entity, a god, the sole guarantor of Maat, cosmic balance between order and chaos. Further east, the Indus Valley presents a paradox. Cities such as Mohenjo-Daro employed standardized bricks, organized street grids, and advanced drainage systems. Yet these cities present a puzzle. Archaeologists have discovered minimal evidence of palaces, royal tombs, or standing armies. Power may have been distributed through mercantile elites, ritual authority, or social norms we no longer fully comprehend. Without a deciphered script, their governance system remains enigmatic. Perhaps a complex civilization without kings. Meanwhile, across the Yellow River and throughout the Americas, independent centers of civilization arose on different crops. Each region domesticated different staples: millet, rice, maize, potatoes. But the underlying pattern repeated. Surplus enabled population growth. Population density required coordination. Coordination produced hierarchy. Hierarchy gave rise to the state. Different environments shaped different cultures. But the structural pressures of civilization pushed humanity onto a single converging trajectory. The world we inhabit today is the continuation of a system whose foundations were laid thousands of years ago. In many respects, we still exist within the structure first assembled by early agricultural societies. The concentration of power, the strain on land and resources, the vulnerability to disease, and the constant negotiation between security and personal freedom. The rise of civilization was a trade-off. Human societies gained the capacity to reshape landscapes, coordinate vast populations, and preserve knowledge across generations. These capacities made large-scale culture, science, and technology possible. But they came at a price. Life became embedded in systems demanding obedience, labor, and permanence. The open freedom of the foraging world yielded to something more complex, crowded, productive, innovative, and constrained. Civilization did not replace nature. It enclosed it. By approximately 2300 BCE, the age of isolated city-states was drawing to a close. With the expansion of urban centers, conflicts over territorial control intensified. Power began to scale. If one ruler could dominate a city, the next question was inevitable: how many cities could be ruled simultaneously? In the city of Akkad, a man emerged who refused traditional kingship limits. He did not seek to govern a single urban center. He sought to bind many into one political body. Through conquest, administration, and force, he would unify the river plains under a single authority. In doing so, he created something new, the world's first empire. His name was Sargon, and his story begins next.